This video is a little different than the others I've been recording. I hope it becomes the first in a series where I share my adventures learning astrophotography. This first installment is a trip report for a class I'm taking through my master's, called Modern Navigation Systems. As part of this class, we had to take a subject we learned and apply it out in the real world and learn something from it. So I chose astrophotography, focusing on the lessons on how to track, identify, and navigate using stars. First, let's define astrophotography. There are many different forms of astrophotography, ranging from imaging planets to nebulae to deep space objects such as neighboring galaxies. Each one of these focus on space objects beyond the Earth, usually without any Earth environment in the picture. In the past, I have done nightscapes, which uses stars to highlight a foreground element or a large landscape. In these pictures, the camera does not move, and your exposure, and subsequently the stars you will be able to see, is limited by your system's sensitivity to light. This sensitivity is usually controlled by which lens you use. Wide-angle lenses to capture a broad landscape generally have bigger apertures to capture more light, while telephoto lenses will have reduced light capturing but also cause star trails on shorter exposures. These trails are caused by Earth's rotation during the exposure. It's a blur, similar to a blur you'd get from a fast-moving race car. While sometimes this blur can be worked into a nightscape to make a very unique picture, you lose any detail on constellations and the delicate gas of a nebula, which is the goal of astrophotography. This is where the major difference between my previous experience in nightscapes and my future adventures in astrophotography lies. In astrophotography, your camera is moving. More specifically, the camera must move on Earth to remain pointing at the same spot on the celestial sphere where you initially aimed it. Due to the vast expanse of space, the celestial sphere can be viewed as a stationary globe surrounding the Earth, which the Earth spins inside of. In order to track stars on the celestial sphere, the camera must be pointed on Earth's rotation axis, so pointing towards the North Pole, true north, or the star Polaris, and adjusting for your latitude, which will ensure that it is parallel with the celestial equator. Once calibrated, you can use a single motor tuned to the Earth's rotation rate to cancel the rotation and keep your camera focusing on the same object in the night sky for hours on end. To accomplish this tracking, I borrowed a Vixen Polari star tracker, which is rotated to align with north and tilted back to account for your latitude. If done properly, it will align with Polaris, the North Star, within its viewfinder. The camera then is attached to a gimbal to allow independent targeting to the center axis motor of the star tracker. There are pre-configured rotation rates, one of which is for tracking the celestial sphere, which is tuned to Earth's rotation. Two things I'd like to point out which I believe are critical for astrophotography. The first of which is having my cell phone attached to the hot shoe mount on the camera. This allows me to use an app which shows the internal inertial reference systems of the phone to help with targeting. Further, I have an intervalometer attached to the star tracker, which will allow for continuous picture taking with no gaps. Having worked out the gear, I drove to eastern Colorado to find darker skies. I found darkskyfinder.com to be very useful to gauge how far I had to drive from Denver to get away from its light pollution, although its glow could still be seen on the horizon. The black dot shows roughly where I ended up finding a good overlook to start taking pictures. There are three main targets I'll be trying to take pictures of, each one chosen for the different camera equipment I currently have access to. The first of which is the Orion constellation. This should fill the frame with my 50mm prime lens, which is possibly the best lens I have for taking crisp star pictures. The second target is Pleiades, or Subaru. This star cluster will be visible through my 70 to 300mm zoom lens, and will mostly fill the frame at 300mm, allowing me to work my way in through the different telephoto lengths, ensuring that my star tracker alignment is accurate and no star trails are forming. If I'm getting crisp pictures of Pleiades, I will attempt to take pictures of the Orion Nebula. This nebula is relatively small compared to the two other features and will require a full 300mm or using my 500mm reflective lens to take a picture of. This is my goal, this is the challenge, this is what I want to work towards over the next 3 nights. The first night, I focused on taking pictures of the Orion constellation through my 50mm lens. Unfortunately, I made a few rookie mistakes, forgetting to set my camera to shoot in RAW, and this image being slightly out of focus, which greatly limited the editing capability of the pictures. However, there were a few lessons learned from this night which applied to others. In this time lapse, you see that the stars are shifting in my field of view by quite a bit. It's not enough to cause star trails. In fact, you can still see the Orion Nebula. However, it was enough movement to limit the stacking capability of these pictures, which would bring out more star detail and also help correct the light pollution occurring from the full moon that night. Thinking about it on the drive back, I realized my phone is using a magnetic compass, and magnetic north is not where true north is. In Colorado, there's a variance of 7 degrees west, so this had to be accounted for on the second night. I mentioned stacking pictures. An important part of astrophotography is post-processing. A lot of those wonderful pictures you see on the internet were not taken right out of the camera in one exposure. Oftentimes they are 10-minute exposures stacked 100 plus times, so you could have 2 hours of total star exposure adding into that picture. And this is how the faintest of light sources, like the gas on a nebula, can be brought out in the picture and shown to its greatest detail. I used 2 different pieces of software to stack pictures throughout these nights: Deep Sky Stacker and Sequator. Each one had its pros and cons, and I have a lot of learning to do before I can truly understand which tool to use at which time. Here are 2 examples of how stacking can help. I took all the pictures taken of the Orion constellation during my first night and put them into the tools to stack. These tools specialize in bringing out the stars, reducing the noise, and helping reduce the light pollution. This is the result. You can see compared to the original picture there are more stars, a little more detail, and the blue hue has been replaced with a gray hue. Some of this was post-processing in Adobe Photoshop. The second picture shows how it can be used to reduce noise. Light pollution is one form of noise. On my GoPro, which I had attached to my camera while it was tracking the stars, it had high ISO noise because of the fast shutter speed. I was able to stack these pictures 5 at a time to reduce the ISO noise and create a video time lapse tracking the stars in greater detail. The first step is to find Polaris, the North Star, for aligning the star tracker. This time lapse, about an hour-long time lapse, has Polaris highlighted and shows all of the stars circling around it. Out in the field, you can use the Big Dipper and Cassiopeia to find Polaris, or use an app to really fine-tune the targeting. Once Polaris was found, the star tracker was aligned, and I mounted my camera onto the star tracker and then used my phone again to point the camera, this time at Pleiades. This next picture is a picture of my setup out in the field with the camera targeting Pleiades, my GoPro on the top recording the stars tracking, and the star tracker pointing off to the left, which is where the North Star was. Prior to this trip, I calculated Pleiades' location in the sky using the Nautical Almanac in azimuth and elevation. I used my phone to aim the camera at this position, zoomed out to 70 millimeters, and took a couple test pictures. The calculation made was for a specific time and date. Unfortunately, I arrived at the location a little bit later than planned, and Pleiades had moved. I was able to capture Pleiades in the corner of my first test exposure, so slowly shifted the camera, zooming in to 300 millimeters to start taking my stackable exposures. This was an interesting experiment, as because of the full moon, I could not see Pleiades with my bare eye and had to rely on my calculations and shifting of the camera to track and frame it. I was able to get about a half hour of exposure on the Pleiades star cluster before clouds moved in. This is the end result. All of the pictures were stacked and lightly edited in Photoshop. We can see the Pleiades constellation along with a variety of neighboring stars. An interesting detail is that the brightest stars have a double or triple star right next to them. These stars should not exist, and I believe it is an issue either with my focusing or the optics in this camera lens not being as crisp, causing this refraction. The third night was all about applying lessons learned. I recaptured the Orion constellation, gaining more detail and crisper stars. Unfortunately, the moon was progressively moving closer and closer to the constellation each night, which is why there's this uneven graying of the scene. Some of the light was leaking in through the edges of my camera lens. I then recaptured the Pleiades star cluster. In this shot, I was able to fix the double and triple star refraction issue. However, I don't know if it was an improvement. It appears my focus might have been just slightly different, causing oblong stars, just merging the refraction artifacts with the actual star. And lastly, I went for the Orion Nebula. This is the stacked version of the Orion Nebula out of my 300mm lens. The red glow, I believe, is from my editing, trying to bring out as many stars as I can in the light-polluted sky from the moon. But you can clearly see where the nebula is and its rough shape. Next, I tried taking a picture of the Orion Nebula through my 500mm lens, zooming in a little tighter to get a little more detail. While I was able to successfully zoom in on the Orion Nebula with my 500mm lens, the stars came out an odd oblong shape. This shape I do not believe is from star trails. This time-lapse shows the direction in which the nebula was transitioning through my field of view. And the oblong stars are not oblong in that direction, they're pointing in a different direction. And I believe this comes down to the optics quality of this lens. This lens is a very basic lens I purchased for the solar eclipse a couple years ago, and has gone through quite a few experiments, I will call them, where the front lens has been scratched up a couple of times, and overall just isn't the highest quality lens for this type of photography. All in all, I would call this adventure a success. I was able to apply concepts I learned in the class to a new hobby. I was able to learn each night and better my pictures. And walking away, I was able to successfully take pictures of the Orion constellation, the Pleiades star cluster, and the Orion Nebula without any star trails, showing successful alignment of the star tracker and understanding of the celestial sphere. Moving forward, I hope to expand my toolkit as a photographer from nightscapes into astrophotography. I've purchased an entry-level telescope of approximately 300mm focal length in hopes of recreating the Pleiades star cluster and the Orion Nebula pictures around New Year's.